So, yet another vertiginous shift in the conduct of elections in Nigeria. An election that has tested the will of the people like no other. And it could only be Adamawa State, home of Atiku Abubakar, presidential candidate of the People's Democratic Party. First, an inconclusive election, and then the collation of the supplementary election results had to be suspended. So the people there were forced to go to elections twice to try to elect their governor. And they almost failed to do so, following an unguarded moment when the strain of political competition seemed to show, as one senior INEC official with brassy, insouciant defiance took electoral malpractice to a higher level live by unilaterally declaring a winner on camera. And a false one at that, a declaration which, in any case, he did not have the authority to make. But tonight, the deadlock is over, and a winner has emerged in the person of the governor of Adamawa State and candidate of the People's Democratic Party, or PDP, Ahmadu Fintiri. But there is a compelling backstory to this governorship election that is yet to emerge. And while we wait for that backstory, questions remain about whether there can ever be a conclusion that can satisfy the opposing politicians who have ignited the political gunpowder in the state. Well, in a moment, I'll be joined from the capital of Adamawa State, Yola, by Arise correspondent Mary Chinda. They're fiddling with the knobs and the buttons at the moment to make sure that she joins us in a hot second. But first, to the studio, and Samson Itodo, who is Executive Director of Yaga Africa, a respected civil society group dedicated to the promotion of democratic governance and which monitored Nigeria's general elections closely. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Charles.
Now, under normal circumstances, I mean, it shouldn't be too complicated, should it, to find the right and lawful winner in a governorship election in Nigeria. But this one went south, didn't it?
Well, like you said, under normal circumstances, but the context for this election was abnormal. Abnormal because, first, you had a supplementary election that was occasioned due to certain infractions in the first ballot, over voting, as well as violence. And the margin of lead between the two candidates was somewhere around 31,000. And if you check the total number of registered voters and those who collected their PVCs in those affected 69 polling units, was about 37,000. And so the entire context, because this election should have been concluded on first ballot, but you've got a supplementary election because of those infractions. And so this is, to an extent, actually an abnormal circumstance. But to complicate things, you saw the attempt by the suspended resident electoral commissioner to undermine the integrity of the process, hijack what appears to be a process that enjoys popular support from the people. And that constitutional aberration or gross misconduct would have brought democracy to its knees. It would have instigated crisis and violence. But for, the people of Adamawa State, as well as the institutions, because there are a few key lessons that we should learn from this. But before we even highlight those lessons, I think this level of impunity cannot go unaddressed. And if the institutions responsible for holding the resident electoral commissioner to account do not rise to the occasion, go beyond suspending the rec, but prosecuting him and then removing him from office, it won't deter further deviant behavior or this malignant attitude on the part of our political class. And I think the nation really needs to rise and not only condemn this, but ensure that action is taken. Good a thing, INEC in its statement today has written or would write to the IG of police to arrest and prosecute him. I think they owe it to Nigerians to constantly update Nigerians on where this action is taken. Secondly, I think INEC can prosecute the resident electoral commissioner without the IG of police, because it's got, the powers to do so, not as a rec, but as an electoral offender, because what he did was in total violation of the provisions of the Electoral Act. And the president, who has mounted the whole concept of leaving a legacy, I think this is an opportunity to send a strong message, not just to Nigerians, but to the entire world, that Section 157 of the Electoral Act vests powers on the president, to remove the resident electoral commissioner or commissioners for two reasons. One is misconduct. And so the Senate and the president do have an opportunity to write their name in gold in ensuring that this particular rec, whom civil society few months ago, when he was appointed, did raise a red flag, has, committed one of the greatest criminal offenses based on his act on Sunday. And it should be met with the appropriate sanction. And it's not just suspension, but arrest, prosecution, removal from office, and he should go to jail.
And what is all this? Because, you've followed what has been happening, not just in Adamawa State, but generally. What is all this doing to the image of INEC, particularly what you just talked about in Adamawa State? It can't be improving its image given the track record over this election cycle.
First, I think it's a mixed bag. Well, INEC has taken remedial actions. And first, we must commend INEC for the sort of swift response on Sunday when it nullified the action taken and ordered that all the officers come to Abuja. But the commission also went ahead to make a declaration. So I can see an INEC trying as much as possible to inspire confidence on the part of Nigerians. Yes, that should be commended. But will that in any way inspire confidence in view of certain, actions that the commission took in the course of the general elections? I think that Nigerians expect more than how INEC has responded, because throughout this process, we've seen situations where INEC had the opportunity, to instrumentalize Section 65 of the Electoral Act that gives INEC the power of review. But we've seen cases and some inconsistencies in implementing that particular provision of the law. But we've also seen, INEC staff, returning officers, who did not only violate the law, the guidelines, but they compromised the process. You look at the case in Rivers, even look at some of the supplementary elections. You also see some of these infractions. So INEC needs to ensure that its staff, and both ad hoc and permanent, face the full wrath of the law. Secondly, INEC also needs to explain to Nigerians, because there are questions that Nigerians have about the conduct of this election. And this is why civil society has called for an independent review or audit of this election, now that the supplementary elections seem to have been concluded largely. So there are big questions that the commission needs to answer. So this one action, though commendable, it's not enough. Nigerians deserve more.
Right, but you would concede that in this particular instance in Adamawa State that INEC is not necessarily to blame, because this is really more about a rogue element within its ranks.
Yes, INEC is not to blame, because first, who is the appointing authority? The appointing authority is the president. And so even the INEC chairman, and the best that the commission can do is what it's done by suspending, because the paragraph 15 of the third schedule to the Constitution gives the commission, the power to delegate its responsibility to resident electoral commissioners. And what INEC did was to withdraw, that delegated powers. And that's what they could do. And so there's an opportunity for reform here. And we've always canvassed that you can't have a situation where the president appoints, all the national commissioners as well as the resident electoral commissioners, and the chairman or the commission does not have powers, to hold these people to account. So we need to really look at this. But I think that given the nature of this and the gravity of this offense, I think that in addition, to this call for the IG to prosecute, I believe INEC can still prosecute the resident electoral commissioner by virtue of the commission of an electoral offense, because this offense is provided in the Electoral Act. So you don't have situations where, this entire process become politicized, because it is clear that the resident electoral commissioner, the suspended resident electoral commissioner, was advancing a particular political interest. And so those whose interests he was defending are out there ready to protect him and shield him from accountability. And this is where Nigerians need to keep their eyes beamed on this particular process, how the IG, both the arrest and the prosecution, Nigerians should be keenly interested, and they owe it to Nigerians to constantly update us on how they've prosecuted this individual. Because if this individual does not go to jail, you're going to have other resident electoral commissioners follow suit. We've got 3 tough elections coming in November, and we know, the nature of elections in these 3 states, and we know how competitive they will be.
The nature of the political actors.
Yeah, if this, is not addressed squarely, then we might as well just bid farewell to, any form of electoral accountability.
Well, that's a very good recommended course of action for INEC, and I certainly hope they're listening. But I also, people place a lot of trust in organizations like your own, IAGA, to keep an eye on these things, as well as the media to draw attention to it. But as blame is being apportioned and post-mortems are being done, in this specific instance of Adamawa State, is the APC also to blame?
Well, to a large extent, because one, you saw a resident electoral commissioner who declared, the candidates of the APC. It is not particularly clear to us whether he had any interactions or he was advancing or perhaps, doing the bidding of those whose party he tried to declare. We don't have any proof. They are just mere allegations and speculations. But if you look at the facts of the case, the big question is, why would a resident electoral commissioner, who ideally should be impartial, non-partisan, hijack a collation process that was yet to be concluded? Because out of 21 local governments, only 10 local governments, the results for 10 local governments have been declared. And then you declare the candidate of, one of the parties as a winner when the process, has not been concluded. It's just clear, that there's something, underneath the Nigerians do not know. And I think that this is an opportunity, for the APC, because the APC as the ruling party, who's also an actor in this case, should come out and condemn, the action of the resident electoral commissioner in the interest of our constitution, in the interest of our democracy, and in the interest of the integrity of the process. It is unacceptable. It is unacceptable, to tolerate this kind of irresponsible behavior from someone who ideally should be an umpire. And so I would expect that the APC, would do so. We've seen cases where, they approach the courts, to secure an ex parte order. And the decision taken by the learned justice today is something that we should, actually highlight.
Does that give you confidence in the judiciary?
It does. Right. And these are the kind of protection actions that we expect to see from the Nigerian judiciary. That when unscrupulous people, try to secure or abuse court process, you rise to the occasion to defend democracy.
Absolutely.
So calling on the council to first, address the court or present a written address was a tactical judicial intervention to salvage the situation. If you had a rogue judge who was compromised, he would have granted that ex parte order, and INEC will be restrained from proceeding with the declaration. But as you can see, they rose to the occasion. I hope that this particular trend will be maintained, all through this determination of the disputes arising from the 2023 elections.
And of course, you've watched these elections. I mean, watched it from a sort of privileged perch as an election observer, an accredited election observer. Your team and all your people. Is what has happened in Adamawa State likely to bring the bigger process of the election generally into wider disrepute, or is it a lesson to be learned? And perhaps the way that INEC has reacted, the way the judiciary has reacted, and so on, has, if you like, raised the democratic spirit of this country.
I think to also add is the way the IG of police have also reacted, by withdrawing the commissioner of police for the state. Very commendable. What the action from these three important democratic institutions, have done is to show us what is possible. That institutions can still function within this quagmire that we find ourselves. And it gives me as a Nigerian hope. But then, is this an isolated case? Quite frankly, I would say it's an isolated case because there were several missed opportunities with the general elections. And because some matters are in court, I'm restrained, to comment on some of those cases.
Well, although in fairness, I mean, it's not entirely sub judice yet, because it only becomes that when the court case actually begins, and it hasn't actually begun. They've deposited their sort of arguments and their case before the judge, but the date has not been announced, so technically it hasn't started. But I mean, I agree with your circumspection.
Yeah. So will this bring this entire process into disrepute? The process is a subject of challenge, both legal, moral, political, and even economic challenge. So, quite frankly, will this action, reverse the disputes and the questions and concerns that people have about our elections? Quite frankly, like I mentioned earlier, I don't think so. There are people who have strong views that some of the elections in the both presidential and governorship elections, did not meet the electoral integrity test.
And do you share those views?
I share with those sentiments. Right. And like we said at Yaga Africa, that the general elections, were not the elections that Nigerians expected. It wasn't the elections that Nigerians deserved, that it was a missed opportunity. And when we say this, we're not referring to the outcome. We're referring to the process. That there are several concerns about the integrity of the process that we cannot ignore. And this is why, an independent inquest or review would help Nigerians, answer this big question. And so that's our position at Yaga Africa.
Yeah, but that independent inquest would not necessarily affect the outcome. In other words, obviously you've got the judicial process, but you've also got, and if you set up an inquiry, usually the inquiry ends up making recommendations to say, well, we think this person should be fired. Yeah. You see what I mean? And we think the system should be rejigged and all the rest of it. What would be the remit of that first inquiry, if you like?
So first, the confidence of Nigerians in the electoral process is at its lowest ebb. And it should worry Nigerians. Whether you recorded electoral victory or you lost in the election, I think the state of the polity and the confidence of citizens that is shaken should worry everyone.
But hasn't it always been that way?
No, before the elections, you saw Nigerians interested, the enthusiasm on the part of Nigerians to vote at this election was quite remarkable. I have worked on elections for 16 years. And quite frankly, this particular electoral cycle was the first time I could see Nigerians believe genuinely that their vote was going to count. They trusted the Electoral Act. They trusted the technologies. But one thing that we ignored was the fact that a technology is only a tool, is a means to an end. You've got human elements who can interfere with this entire process. And what we saw is the role that compromised individuals, played in undermining the integrity of the process. If you look at issues around logistics, you look at issues around, the inconsistencies in the application of the electoral law, you clearly see some ominous signs of manipulation. And everything that happened, it's not new, because civil society published the Election Manipulation Risk Index. There are 3 reports, that were published highlighting key variables that the politicians were determined to rig this election. Some of them succeeded, some of them didn't. But citizens, were alive to their responsibility. And so, if you have an independent inquest or an investigation, what will it help citizens do? We don't know what will be the outcome of that, because there are questions that need to be answered. Maybe if those questions are provided, maybe if citizens have access to certain data and information, perhaps it could pacify or even inspire their confidence. Because for people who lost in this election, they want to see that the people who went to vote didn't vote for them. And that way they will be confident that they lost through a credible process.
Absolutely.
But if you deprive them of the opportunity to see that this entire process is transparent, we would continue to leave room for people to doubt the credibility of this election. And this is why I will continue to urge the incoming president to put electoral reform as a cardinal point, of his governance agenda. Because you can't come out of a process of this nature, given the shortcomings, and ignore, electoral reform.
That's the sort of thing President Yar'Adua did, wasn't it? In 2007.
We hope that the president-elect Tinubu, when he becomes president, when he's sworn in, will take these issues frontally, because it will be difficult, to raise national consciousness. It will be difficult, to raise the salience of this national glue that keeps the nation together, if this question about the integrity of the election is not addressed.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And we've got about a couple of minutes or so left. I mean, fascinating talking with you, but just returning to Adamawa State, for example, you've had a lot of experience in monitoring elections and, seeing the trends and so on. When this kind of issue that we had there occurs, how much does it cause disaffection and hostility, in a situation where there's already bitter rivalry? I mean, how much does it further polarize people in Adamawa State, for example?
Charles, one of the things that troubles me a lot is if you look at all the elections that we've conducted since 1999 till date, the aftermath has deepened the divisions and the level of polarization of this country. And this current administration, failed to lead a national reconciliation and a national healing program post the 2019 elections. And these divisions are way deeper than we think. And it's just really sad, because for a festival of democracy, which elections represent, it should be a time, to build sort of national consensus. First, you have a political class that is so averse to bipartisan consensus. For heaven's sake, which country in the world makes progress without bipartisan consensus? We can't even agree on certain national questions. Everything is politicized, everything is ethnicized.
Well, they're learning from the Americans, aren't they? All you have to do is go to Congress.
America has its own problem. We've got our own problems. And I think that we've got an opportunity. If there's something I'd like to see post May 29th, it's this rhetoric that deepens the division, be reduced to the barest minimum. And I want to see a president.
I mean, that would be the ideal thing.
I want to see a president who will not rise and say the distribution of the promise of democracy will be, allocated to people based on the number of votes that I secured from a particular geopolitical zone. Because when you assume the office of the president, you are president for all Nigerians,
Absolutely.
whether those who voted
You're
for you or
supposed
not.
to be.
And not what President Buhari, the kind of rhetoric when he came to office, when he was at USIP, and he said, you don't expect me, to distribute patronage, to a particular geopolitical zone where I get at 5% of the vote. They are also Nigerians. So whether they vote for you or not, you've got a duty to ensure that there is equitable distribution, of this promise of democracy.
That comes with political maturity, though.
Exactly. So that's what we expect, to see. Secondly, the National Assembly also has a critical role to play. We can see, the politicking around the distribution of principal offices in the National Assembly. Nigerians want to see a leadership that represents our diversity because there's that strength in our diversity. The third thing, in addressing that particular issue is you want to see political parties. You want to see our religious institutions and our traditional institutions are coming together, to discuss this question of nationalism. If we don't see this country as ours, and we all belong to this country called Nigeria, this entity, that it's not just a mere geographical expression, but one that lives in our hearts as humans who subscribe, to this notion, this nation called Nigeria, then we're going to have a difficult problem trying to advance our development. And I hope that both the incoming president and the governors at the state will consider this a priority, that inclusive governance is critical for Nigeria to leapfrog its development. Because what we have today, it's not the Nigeria of our dreams.
Absolutely brilliant talking with you. Thank you very much indeed. We're all the wiser for it. And Samson Itodo is the Executive Director of Yaga Africa, a respected civil society group dedicated to the promotion of democratic governance and which also monitored Nigeria's general elections very closely. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
indeed.
Charles. Always a pleasure.